This is really the way that I think we should be talking about the Penny and Jordan Neely tragedy, and it is a tragedy. So Jordan Neely had a long history of mental health issues before tragic NYC subway chokehold death. So there's a whole timeline here of this guy literally begging for mental health services that he didn't receive. In some instances, Jordan Neely told cops he was schizophrenic and hadn't taken his meds. Other times, the 30-year-old complained to officers of stomach pains or told them he was suicidal, police sources said. He had accepted help from the Bowery Residence Committee via the New York City Department of Homeless Services at times through at least 2020, the sources said. But one thing is clear. Neely never got the help he so desperately needed. And this is the New York Post, by the way.
Yeah,
This
this
is
is the
the New
same.
York
This is the
Post.
Murder Express paper. Yeah.
Yes. Even they're saying this. As his quote, as his aunt, as his blood, I was crying out for medical help for my nephew, but everything was about insurance. Funny how everything comes back to that, isn't it? His aunt, Carolyn Neely, told the Post. Doctors knew his condition. He needed to be treated. He wasn't a bad person, she continued, adding that Neely was in and out of Bellevue Hospital. Quote, he just needed better help from doctors who did not give him help when I asked, she said. I was really frustrated. I didn't know what to do anymore. Neely, who sank into a deep depression after his stepfather brutally murdered his mom in 2007, began crossing paths with cops in earnest about 6 years later, police sources said. He was known as a troubled street person who hung around lower Manhattan, especially around East Houston, but he turned up in Harlem, Queens, and Brooklyn as well. On the afternoon of January 24th, 2013, for instance, cops found Neely on West 145th Street in Manhattan complaining that his body was numb and he was hearing voices. He voluntarily went to Mount Sinai Morningside for treatment, police sources said, but he appeared to worsen in the following years. This is all the way back in 2013. And you're going to see he gets worse and worse and worse over time. On January 14th, 2016, sources said cops brought him to the hospital when he said he was suicidal. 8 months later, authorities again escorted him to the hospital after they got several complaints of an irate, intoxicated man threatening others around West 168th Street. By 2018, police were seeing Neely frequently, 4 times in February and twice in March, sources said. Sometimes they brought him to the hospital or a shelter. Sometimes he refused to go. That July, cops took him to the hospital after he threatened the conductor and scared passengers on a train that had left the 207th Street station, sources said. You see how this is escalating as he's
Right.
not getting the services he requested?
Right. And it just gets more and more severe.
A series of near monthly calls followed for the rest of the year. In February 2019, he told the cops that he wanted psychiatric help because he was hearing voices, sources said. Right here, why was this man not institutionalized? A member of the citywide mobile crisis outreach team saw him wandering aimlessly on a train platform around Norfolk Street on March 12, 2020. He was disheveled and smelled, police sources said, and he'd been off his meds for months. He was brought to Bellevue Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation, though it's not clear what happened after. The crisis team found him 4 more times during the height of the COVID pandemic, once in April 2020 and 3 times in May. The team encouraged Neely to use the city's homeless services, but he appears to have rarely stayed in a hospital or shelter for very long. Cops continued to engage over the next year with the homeless Neely, who often mentioned that he was schizophrenic, had ADHD, and was sometimes suicidal. So now this is interesting because this article focuses on this, but not the assaults. But another article that focuses on the assaults basically picks up from where the timeline here leaves
Right.
off. So this is Fox News, a related organization. Jordan Neely had history of attacks on subway before New York City chokehold death. The 30-year-old vagrant, who once performed as a Michael Jackson impersonator, had been arrested dozens of times, including most recently for vicious assaults on subway riders, court records show. And you see, we left off at 2020, now 2021. Neely socked a 67-year-old woman as she exited the Bowery station in the East Village in Lower Manhattan. The woman sustained a broken nose, a fractured orbital bone, and, quote, bruising, swelling, and substantial pain to the back of her head in the November 12th attack, according to a criminal complaint. Neely pleaded guilty to felony assault February 9th in exchange for a 15-month alternative to incarceration program, according to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. He was supposed to stay in a treatment facility and abstain from drugs. If he had completed the program, the felony assault would have been reduced to a misdemeanor, but he skipped a compliance court date and left the facility. I just want to point out how insane a system that would take somebody like this who's severely mentally ill and give them a conditional release like this without any support services and expect them to be able to manage that. How would he even know what day he's supposed to be back in court under his circumstances?
Of course. And the reaction to this incident, not the verdicts, to be clear, but the reaction to this incident suggests that when people like this act up, it's okay to just do whatever you want to them. That's it.
Right. Like, why aren't you furious with the city for putting both Penny and Neely in that situation? It never should have happened.
Exactly.
A warrant was issued for his arrest on February 23rd. It wasn't immediately clear how long he spent in jail awaiting the resolution of the assault case. From January 2020 to August 2021, he was arrested for public lewdness after pulling down his pants and exposing himself to a female stranger, misdemeanor assault for hitting a woman in the face, and criminal contempt for violating a restraining order. All three cases were dismissed as part of his February 9th plea deal. In June 2019, Neely attacked Philemon Castillo Baltazar, 68, on the platform of the West 4th Street station in Greenwich Village, according to the court papers. Quote, out of nowhere, he punched me in the face, the victim told the New York Daily News. He said he'd seen Neely looking for food in the trash bins. 1 month prior, he hit a man so hard in the face that he broke his nose on the platform of the Broadway Lafayette station, the same subway stop where he died 4 years later. For both 2019 cases, he pleaded guilty to misdemeanor assault and was sentenced to 6 months in jail. Outreach workers were so familiar with Neely that he was on the city's top 50 list, an internal roster kept by the Department of Homeless Services of people living on the street who were most in need of help, the New York Post reported. He had cycled in and out of hospitals and jails for years. Now, it's insane that you would even have a list like that, because why are they out on the street? Why are they out on the street? If you have a list of this top 50, why aren't they either in a shelter or in a psychiatric services home? Now, a lot has been made of, oh, well, the laws need to be changed. No, they don't. Not in his case. The laws are perfectly adequate to have committed him. You have the involuntary commitment standard. Person has a mental illness for which care and treatment in a mental hospital is essential to his/her welfare. Person's judgment is too impaired for him/her to understand the need for such care and treatment. As a result of his/her mental illness, the person poses a substantial threat of harm to self or others. Boom. It's right there. Right there. You legally, he should never have been on the street. It's not that the laws are too lax. He was the poster child for the person who qualifies for involuntary commitment under the current laws, under the current standards. So why are there so many mentally ill people on the street? Now, Neely is an extreme example. I mentioned in the previous segment, the New York Times did an excellent report on how the system fails people and it can lead to violence. But even they, in a 10-year span, were only able to find 97 cases in a city of 8 million or 8.5 million, depending on what stat you look at, people, 97 incidents in a 10-year period. So this doesn't happen often. but it does happen. Why is it that you have all of these mentally ill people on the street? You didn't have this in the 50s, right? We don't think of 1950 cities being full of mentally ill people walking around the street because they were institutionalized. So there was a big movement beginning in the 50s with the introduction of Thorazine. That's really where it began to deinstitutionalize people. Now, this is from a special Frontline did. Now, this is quoting from a book, Out of the Shadows: Confronting America's Mental Illness Crisis, that was written in the 90s. So it stops there, but the situation has not improved. So the history is still, and the numbers are still relevant. Deinstitutionalization is the name given to the policy of moving severely mentally ill people out of large state institutions and then closing part or all of those institutions. Deinstitutionalization began in 1955 with the widespread introduction of chlorpromazine, commonly known as Thorazine, the first effective antipsychotic medication, and received a major impetus 10 years later with the enactment of federal Medicaid and Medicare. The magnitude of deinstitutionalization of the severely mentally ill qualifies it as one of the largest social experiments in American history. In 1955, there were 558,239 severely mentally ill patients in the nation's public psychiatric hospitals. In 1994, this number had been reduced by 486,620 patients to 71,619. It is important to note, however, that the census of 558,239 patients in public psychiatric hospitals in 1955 was in relationship to the nation's total population at the time, which was 164 million. By 1994, the nation's population had increased to 260 million. If there had been the same proportion of patients per population in public mental health hospitals in 1994 as there had been in 1955, the patients would have totaled 885,010. The true magnitude of deinstitutionalization, then, is the difference between 885,010 and 71,619. In effect, approximately 92% of the people who would have been living in public psychiatric hospitals in 1955 were not living there in 1994. Now, this is a book from 30 years ago. We can assume the situation has not improved. It might actually be worse proportionately than it was when this was written. So there you can see when they introduced the first antipsychotic drugs, and then Medicaid and Medicare. Now we'll get into this a little bit. Why did Medicaid and Medicare being enacted lead to such a drop? Because they didn't cover institutionalization. So it disincentivized states and cities from institutionalizing people because they couldn't get reimbursement from Medicaid and Medicare for it. Most of those who were deinstitutionalized in the nation's public psychiatric hospitals were severely mentally ill. Between 50 and 60% of them were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Another 10 to 15% were diagnosed with manic depressive illness and severe depression. An additional 10 to 15% were diagnosed with organic brain diseases, epilepsy, strokes, Alzheimer's diseases, and brain damage secondary to trauma. The remaining individuals residing in public psychiatric hospitals had conditions such as mental retardation with psychosis, autism, and other psychiatric disorders of childhood, and alcoholism and drug addiction with concurrent brain damage. The fact that most deinstitutionalized people suffer from various forms of brain dysfunction was not as well understood when the policy of deinstitutionalization got underway. Thus, deinstitutionalization has helped create the mental illness crisis by discharging people from public psychiatric hospitals without ensuring that they receive the medication and rehabilitation services necessary for them to live successfully in the community. Deinstitutionalization further exacerbated the situation because once the public psychiatric beds had been closed, they were not available for people who later became mentally ill. And this situation continues up to the present. So you have a combination of factors here. Hey, look, I'm a big fan of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I read it at a very impressionable age. It made a big impression on me. I get that there were horrors to that system. They started out with good intentions, but eventually those institutions became overcrowded and horrible. They were actually built to get the mentally ill out of jails because they very often were winding up in jails. That's why they started building psychiatric institutions. There was a good intention there at first. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them were run in a pretty decent way that tried to give people a sense of community. Up in Buffalo, actually, there's a Frederick Law Olmsted designed grounds of a psychiatric hospital that he created with a lot of open space and grass for mental health, so people could get fresh air and walk around. And it's a beautiful campus, a little creepy now, but it's quite lovely. Um, but eventually, they became overcrowded dumping grounds, just horrible. And that's where you get the impression of those one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of
Right.
institutions. So this seemed at first like a very humanitarian gesture. Like, hey, we can integrate them into the community, but part of that plan was supposed to be funding community health centers so that they'd have a kind of constant outpatient support. That never happened. Um, so to continue on that score, so Mother Jones did a good timeline on the history of this and just selecting a few relevant portions of it. So 1963, so you have 1955, you have the beginning of this collapse in inpatient treatment because of the introduction of Thorazine. So 1963, John F. Kennedy signs the Community Mental Health Act to provide federal funding for the construction of community-based preventive care and treatment facilities. Between the Vietnam War and an economic crisis, the program was never adequately funded. 1965, with the passage of Medicaid, states are incentivized to move patients out of state mental hospitals and into nursing homes and general hospitals because the program excludes coverage for people in institutions for mental diseases. That's what it's really about. That's why they won't institutionalize a guy like Neely, because they don't want to pay for it.
Right.
67, the California legislature passes the Lanterman Petrus Short Act, which makes involuntary hospitalization of mentally ill people vastly more difficult. 1 year after the law goes into effect, the number of mentally ill people in the criminal justice system doubles. There are 650 community health facilities serving, in 1977, 1.9 million mentally ill patients a year. 1980, President Jimmy Carter signs the Mental Health Systems Act, which aims to restructure the community mental health center program and improve services for people with chronic mental illness. 1981, Ronald Reagan. What a surprise. Under President Ronald Reagan, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act repeals Carter's community health legislation and establishes block grants for the states, ending the federal government's role in providing services to the mentally ill. Federal mental health spending decreases by 30%. 1984, an Ohio based study finds that up to 30% of homeless people are thought to suffer from serious mental illness. 85, federal funding drops to 11% of community mental health agency budgets. 90, clozapine, the first atypical antipsychotic drug to be developed, is approved by the FDA as a treatment for schizophrenia. 2004, studies suggest approximately 16% of prison and jail inmates are seriously mentally ill, roughly 320,000 people. This year, there are about 100,000 psychiatric beds in public and private hospitals. That means there are more than 3 times as many seriously mentally ill people in jails and prisons than in hospitals. 2009, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, states are forced to cut $4.35 billion in public mental health spending over the next 3 years, the largest reduction in funding since deinstitutionalization. 2010, there are 43,000 psychiatric beds in the United States, or about 14 beds per 100,000 people, the same ratio as in 1850. So that is how we got here in brief. So now, speaking of the laws, Adams, really since the Neely incident, has really been pushing this idea that we need a more liberal standard for involuntarily institutionalizing people. Right now, it's a harm to yourself or others. He wants to expand that standard. So he called a meeting with Community Board 5, which is in Midtown Times Square. But even the community board wasn't going for it, and this is why. Quote, what's clear is that we have hundreds and hundreds of people who already meet the current standard and can't get the help they need. Mary Brosnahan of Coalition for the Homeless said, they're begging to be admitted, but there's no capacity. Why aren't you focused on that? The Adams administration has called on state legislators for over a year to change the mental hygiene law so that involuntary hospitalization would be justified in circumstances that extend beyond the current standard of serious harm to oneself or others. The Brownstein bill, backed by City Hall, would allow involuntary hospitalizations on the grounds of, quote, substantial inability of the person to meet his or her basic need for food, clothing, shelter, or medical care. Okay, so first of all, if you're not meeting the needs of people who already meet the current standard, how are you going to have the facilities for an expanded standard? This is just a complete smokescreen of lack of funding. So finally, from the Hastings Center, they address these questions of how you would enact this. According to a 2018 report by the Manhattan Institute, non-forensic state psychiatric centers in New York City lost about 15% of their total adult bed capacity from 2014 to 2018. During roughly the same period from 2015 to 2017, the number of seriously mentally ill homeless New Yorkers increased by 22%. And every year from 2014 to 2018, there was a rise in the number of emotionally disturbed person calls responded to by the New York City Police Department. The lack of capacity of psychiatric institutions is not a new problem. As a result of deinstitutionalization, a movement beginning in the 1950s that moved psychiatric patients out of state institutions and into communities, many mental health care facilities closed. The significant reduction of beds for psychiatric patients means that many people with severe mental illness who need residential treatment cannot receive it. The problem is reflected in decreasing lengths of stay for patients in New York State psychiatric hospitals. The consequences of involuntarily committing people before addressing the shortages within psychiatric centers will be significant. Mentally ill and homeless people currently cycle through the criminal justice system. People who are homeless are more likely to wind up in jail, and formerly incarcerated people are 13 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general population. Additionally, it is estimated that 44% of people incarcerated in jail and 37% of people incarcerated in prison have a mental health condition. With New York City's new plan, it is not difficult to imagine an outcome in which mentally ill homeless people also cycle in and out of psychiatric institutions. Okay, so this is really the problem with the conversation. As so often happens, you have a very complex problem that really needs to be addressed by better funding for services for the vulnerable. And instead, the grifters on both sides want to turn it into a culture war shout down, which is completely beside the point and not helping anybody. Whether it's the grifters calling this incident race based, or whether it's the grifters playing up the heroism of Penny, who, again, I'm not disparaging Penny. I think he stepped up to protect those people. But that's not even what the story is about. The story should properly be understood as a tragic situation that should never have happened, that is the result of decades of misguided policy and unwillingness to protect the most vulnerable people in society.
I think that's very well put. And I think that, this whole thing paints a picture. It's a lot of what that Joker movie was about, 5 years ago. Somebody mentioned Bernie Getz in the super chats here, which we'll get to in a minute. But, that movie revolves around the inciting incident of that film is the subway murder, oddly enough. And it's about, a mentally ill person who just has no infrastructure. He has no support system to go to because the society does not make that investment. And part of the veneration of Daniel Penny as a hero is in service of this very sort of frontiersman kind of narrative. I mean, this is what the right wants to push, that it just falls to the individual to protect themselves and the weak, and that don't expect any support from the system to intercept these people before it gets violent. That's not the role of the state. It's the role of the individual to protect what's theirs through violence and through force. And this serves that vision of the world very well. A vision of the world that says that this should have never happened in the first place. There were a million chances that society had to prevent this in the first place, and that if we actually gave a fuck about our own people and about human life as a society, we would have intercepted Jordan Neely long before it got to this point. That's not what they're selling. They are selling bootstraps, every man for himself, and
Right.
Daniel Penny is a great. He's the perfect sort of poster child for them. Rittenhouse was too. I'm not saying I would have voted guilty on either of those juries. I would not have, but that's besides the point, as far as I can see, and I think that's what you're saying too. Like, that's besides the point. The point is the cultural conversation has been really hijacked in a very, very unproductive way.
Exactly. Um, to go out there and to try to define this as a racial incident, um, or to present it in a very ironically racialized way, as Piers Morgan did in your segment, where he's talking about him as a deranged
Well,
lunatic.
I think the reaction to this has been racialized.
It,
Yes.
it
Yes.
has. It
Yeah.
has. The same people who are saying it has nothing to do with race are making it very much about race.
Making it pretty obviously, at least somewhat about race. Not entirely. Like I said, this whole frontier. I have to show you a Laura Ingraham video. I'll probably pull it up at the end of the show. I was almost going to include it, but it was a little off message. But it's amazing that you have two examples of vigilantism just kind of in the news all at once. But this ultimately is it's a very right wing point of view. It's a very, very just sort of stark. Every person for themselves. That's it. Don't expect any support from the system. That's not what the system is there for. The system is there to be dismantled, and this fits that narrative very, very well. And that's why they're really touting this verdict, because
Right.
they see it
Right.
as a win for their side of the culture war, which it is. And I'm not saying it's a win I would have denied them with a vote, but I don't think that this cultural conversation is the right one to be having. I think, the segment we just did is much more where we ought to be going with this.
Well, that's the last conversation they want you to have,
Exactly.
because then you actually have to put some money into taking care of people.
Right. Right. And look at where that money ends up getting spent now. Jails.
Right.
Jails. But you haven't
Right.
eliminated crazy people.
Right.
It's just now,
Yeah.
instead of getting health care, they're locked in a cage.
Yeah, no, we turned our jails into our mental health services.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yep.
Please clap.